The desert evening was sinking into a deep orange when Luke Hartman first saw her, a towering Apache woman, broad-shouldered, weary, and swaying on her feet as though the long miles behind her had pulled every drop of strength from her bones. He had been riding back from checking fence lines on the far ridge when he spotted a shape leaning against a juniper tree. And when he approached, he realized she wasn't leaning. She was collapsing. Without hesitation, he slid off his horse, lifted her heavy frame as best he could, and offered her the one thing she needed more than anything: water. The giant woman's breath trembled as she drank slow but desperate gulps. Her hands trembling against the tin cup Luke held steady. She said nothing, only looked at him with dark, intense eyes that carried stories of wind, battle, and ancestral fire. Luke didn't ask who she was or where she had come from. He guided her to his ranch, sat her beneath the porch shade, and let her rest while he brought more water and a blanket. Careful to show respect, careful not to overstep. Her size didn't frighten him. He had seen many Apache men who were giants of the desert, but a woman of such stature was rare, and he could tell she carried a spirit shaped by hardship, not cruelty. When the moon rose high and silver over the plains, she finally whispered her name, Tala, voice deep and echoing like distant thunder, telling him in a few sharp breaths that she had been separated from her people, traveling days without water, her strength failing. Luke nodded quietly, offering food and shelter. But before he could ask more, she fell asleep in the chair as though nature itself had extinguished her flame for the night. Luke watched her for a long moment, wondering if helping her had placed a target on his back. Yet his conscience whispered that doing the right thing often cost something, and he was willing to pay it. He covered her with a blanket and retreated inside, leaving the lantern glowing so the night wouldn't swallow her completely. But when dawn broke, he awoke, not to the soft morning breeze or the sound of his horses, but the rumble, low, steady, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. He stepped outside and froze. Across the ridges, across both hillsides, across the valley that cradled his ranch like a bowl, stood warriors, hundreds of them, as still as stone, their silhouettes sharp against the morning sun. And as his eyes adjusted, the number became clearer, more overwhelming. 300 Apache warriors had encircled his entire property. Horses snorted, hooves shifted, and the entire valley seemed carved from tension. Luke didn't reach for his rifle. He knew that would be suicide. Instead, he slowly raised his hands and looked toward Tala, who stood now, awake, strong, towering beside him, her presence suddenly far more commanding than the night before. The warriors didn't shout, didn't charge. They waited, watching her. Tala took one step forward, then two, and every warrior on the ridge responded with a ripple, like a wave of movement, flowing through the hills. She turned to Luke, meeting his eyes with a look that held gratitude, apology, and something deeper, respect. Then she raised her hand toward her people and spoke in her native tongue, her voice booming across the valley, carried by the morning air like a drumbeat. Luke couldn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. She was vouching for him. She was telling them he had saved her. She was telling them he had done what many men would never dare offer kindness without fear. A chief rode down from the ridge, his horse powerful and painted with ochre and ash. And as he dismounted before Luke, he studied the rancher with a gaze so sharp it felt like a blade. But then he bowed his head slightly, an honor Luke did not expect, and said in clear English, "You gave life to one of ours. Today we return that honor." Luke exhaled only when he realized the warriors were no longer threatening. They were protecting. Tala stepped closer and placed a hand on his shoulder, telling him in a soft, rumbling tone that her people believed strongly in reciprocity. One act of life-saving kindness must be repaid with protection equal in power. The chief explained that raiders, white outlaws, not Apache, had been roaming nearby and had marked Luke's ranch as an easy target. Luke hadn't known, but Tala had. She had recognized the outlaw tracks near his fence lines the night before and told her people at first light. That was why they had come, not for revenge, not for intimidation, but to stand as a shield between Luke and the coming danger. The realization struck Luke with such force that he nearly forgot to breathe. The 300 warriors surrounding his ranch were not a threat, they were a promise. The day stretched long as the warriors formed a living wall across the valley, and when the outlaws rode in at sunset, expecting an easy raid, they instead found the fierce silhouettes of 300 Apache riders rising from the dust like spirits of the earth. The raiders turned tail before a single arrow was drawn. Luke watched from his porch, awe filling every inch of him, and when the danger had passed, the chief approached once more, nodding solemnly before guiding his warriors back toward the mountains. Tala remained a moment longer, her powerful frame silent in the glow of the dying sun. She told Luke that kindness changes destinies, even between worlds that seldom trust each other. Then she rode after her people, leaving Luke alone on his ranch, but not the same man he had been. The day before, he watched the long lines of riders vanish into the orange haze, feeling the weight of the moment settle into his soul. And as he stood there, wind brushing across the valley, he knew one simple truth: when you give kindness, even to a stranger, it returns in ways you can never imagine. Friends, if you want to hear more unforgettable Wild West stories full of courage, honor, and destiny, make sure you subscribe to this channel, because every story here carries a lesson that might just change your life the way kindness changed Luke's. The quiet after the Apache warriors vanished settled over Luke Hartman's ranch like morning mist, but inside his chest the echoes of what had happened still thundered, reminding him that life could turn upside down in a matter of heartbeats. For days he replayed every moment, the earth shaking, arrival of 300 warriors, Tala's commanding voice. The outlaw threat he hadn't known was coming, and though the valley looked calm again, Luke could feel destiny stirring beneath the surface like a river under sand. On the third morning after their departure, he saddled his horse and rode to the far ridge to check for any signs of those outlaws returning, scanning the ground for prints, listening to the wind for anything out of place. But what he found instead was something he hadn't expected at all. A single spear planted into the earth, decorated with feathers and beads in the colors of the Apache, and tied to it was a strip of leather etched with symbols Luke didn't recognize. He dismounted, touching the spear with care, and as the sun glinted off the polished stone spearhead, a shadow passed over him, a rider approaching from the east. For a heartbeat he tensed, but then he recognized the massive silhouette of Tala, astride a horse that looked small beneath her towering frame. She rode with a calm strength, stopping beside him with the breeze lifting her long dark hair like a cloak. She explained that the spear was not a warning, but an invitation. Her people wanted him to come to their village, not as a prisoner, not as a supplicant, but as an honored guest whose kindness had changed the course of a warrior woman's fate. Luke hesitated. Traveling alone into Apache lands wasn't something a rancher like him had ever imagined doing, but Tala reassured him that no harm would come to a man whose heart had already spoken for him. Guided by her, Luke rode through winding canyons, open plains, and narrow passes, carved by ancient rivers until they reached a hidden valley where smoke rose gently from lodges. Children played in the dust, and warriors sharpened spears, while elders watched with thoughtful eyes. The moment Luke stepped into the village, the world seemed to pause. Dozens of eyes turned toward him, not hostile, not fearful, but curious, measuring, evaluating. The chief approached, the same imposing figure who had bowed his head days before, and extended his hand in greeting, something most Apache reserved only for those they accepted as allies. They led Luke to a central fire where stories were told, where he listened to elders speak of their land, their battles, their traditions, and where Tala shared the truth of why she had been wandering alone. A rival band had challenged her leadership during a sacred ceremony, forcing her into exile until she could prove her worth again. Luke understood then why her people had rallied so fiercely when she called. They admired her strength, her courage, and her spirit. and Luke sensed she was destined for something greater than even they realized. As night fell and drums began to echo across the valley, the chief turned to Luke and said, "You saved one of our greatest. Now she will choose her path, but know this. Your life and hers are now tied by the thread of destiny." Luke didn't know what that meant. Not yet, but he felt the weight of it settle gently inside him, like a secret he wasn't meant to unravel all at once. As he rode back to his ranch the next morning, escorted partway by young warriors who admired him like a legend already forming, Luke felt something new blossoming in his chest, an understanding that life had shifted, that he had stepped into a story far bigger than a simple rancher tending his land. And when he reached home and saw the spear he had brought back standing by his porch, he realized it was more than a symbol. It was a promise that his journey with Tala and the Apache was only beginning. Friends, if you want to follow this powerful story full of honor, danger, and unexpected destiny, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because the next chapter will take you deeper into the Wild West than ever before. Luke Hartman spent the next few days on his ranch with the uneasy feeling that the world around him had shifted into a new rhythm, as though every breeze carried whispers from Apache lands and every sunrise brought the weight of an unseen future. He went about his chores, mending fences, tending horses, hauling water, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Tala, the towering woman whose strength and gratitude had drawn him into a world far deeper than the one he'd been living. One evening, as he leaned against the corral, watching the sky burn into shades of red and gold, he felt the air change, thicker, colder, humming with the tension he'd learned to recognize when danger lurked nearby. His horses sensed it too, stomping and snorting. Luke took his rifle from the porch, not out of fear but vigilance. And then he saw it, a dust cloud rising from the western flats, not shaped like cattle, not shaped like riders in formation, but jagged and chaotic, the way outlaw bands rode when they didn't care who heard them coming. Luke's jaw tightened. He saddled his horse, ready to ride for help. But before he could mount, a whistle pierced the air, sharp, echoing, unmistakable. From the ridge behind his ranch appeared a line of riders. Apache riders. 20 of them led by Tala herself, massive and commanding, her presence like thunder wrapped in flesh. Luke exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding as she rode toward him, telling him quickly and with urgency that the outlaw band had not given up. They'd scouted his ranch during the night and were returning now with twice as many men. Luke asked how she knew, and her answer was simple. The land speaks, and we listen. Before he could question her, the 20 Apache warriors formed a defensive arc around the ranch, their horses steady and their eyes sharp as flint. Tala dismounted and met Luke at the gate, telling him that this battle would be different. This time the outlaws wanted more than supplies. They wanted to burn the ranch, claiming Luke had collaborated with the Apache and needed to be made an example. Luke felt anger twist in his chest. He hadn't asked for this war, but he wouldn't abandon his home or the people who had stood for him. The outlaws broke over the horizon like a wave of dust and gunmetal, shouting threats, their numbers at least 30 strong. For a tense heartbeat, the world held still. Then the chief's voice echoed from behind Tala. He had arrived silently with 50 more warriors, forming a second line around the ranch. Their presence so sudden and overwhelming it felt like the earth itself had risen to defend. Luke, the outlaws hesitated, unsure, but desperation pushed them forward. A single gunshot cracked the silence, and the battle erupted like lightning striking dry brush. Arrows sliced through the air with deadly precision. Horses reared, and gunfire echoed against the canyon walls. Luke fought beside the Apache warriors, not as a rancher, but as a man defending everything he held dear. Tala stood at the center of the line, like a storm given shape, her strength unmatched, her voice rising above the chaos as she commanded her warriors with fierce clarity. The outlaws hadn't expected organized resistance, certainly not from a united Apache force, and within minutes their attack faltered, morale breaking under the weight of an enemy they had underestimated. When the battle ended and the dust settled, the outlaws fled into the distance, leaving behind shattered pride and empty threats. Luke stood in the fading light, chest heaving, watching Tala wipe dust from her brow with calm composure. And he realized something he had been avoiding admitting to himself. He didn't just respect her, he admired her, deeply, in a way that went beyond gratitude. The chief approached, placing a hand on Luke's shoulder, and said, "Your courage is known now, among your people, among ours. The path ahead is changing." Luke knew he was right. Something powerful had begun, something he didn't yet have words for. As night fell and the warriors rode back toward their homeland, Tala lingered a moment longer, her eyes meeting Luke's with a look that said their story was far from over. "The next dawn," she said, "will bring choices." Then she turned and rode into the darkness, leaving Luke standing beneath the starlit sky, knowing the next chapter of his life was already galloping toward him. Friends, if you're loving this unfolding journey of honor, danger, and unexpected connection, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because the next part will take you deeper than ever into the heart of the Wild West.